Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So welcome to the Ainalaiyn Space Residency Research Seminars. So throughout this week, we've welcomed researchers who have shared their multidisciplinary approach to art history and visual culture, and they've brought innovative perspectives to questions of ecologies, epistemologies, and histories. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this morning. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The lecture is going to be recorded. And in the same format as our other lectures, our lecturer will present their research, and then at the end we'll have some time to ask questions, share your thoughts, and kind of discuss any comments that you have. In the meantime, it would be great if anyone could just switch off their microphones just to avoid any kind of clashing sounds. But if you need any technical assistance, just message us in the comments and we'll do our best to assist you. So today I'd like to introduce our speaker. Aliya Say is an art writer, editor, and strategy consultant based in London. Her current research is concerned with botanical abstraction in the work of 20th century artist mystics, including Hilma af Klint and Emma Kunz, and with the intersection of vegetal ontology, mystical states, and ecological thinking. She's doing her PhD at Aarhus University, Denmark, under the supervision of Professor Jacob Vonberg and Professor Michael Marder. Her other interests include art in the age of Anthropocene, the present and future forms of human and more than human intelligence, mysticism and nature connectedness, and their wider effects on the planetary ecology. Aliya has worked across strategy, development, and public programming in galleries, art foundations, the tech sector, and academia. Her essays and reviews have appeared in publications including Art Forum, Frieze, The White Review, the Art Newspaper, and others. And she is a recipient of the Novo Nordisk Foundation grant and a former research fellow at the Serpentine Gallery UK. So now I'll hand over to Aliya to present her lecture titled Mystical Consciousness and Thinking with Plants, from Demeter to Emma Kunz. So over to you, Aliya.
Thank you so much. Morning, everyone. Thank you, Phoebe, for waking up together with me and for this generous introduction. Thank you to Enduro for the generous invitation. Really happy to be here. But actually, before I start my talk, I wanted to ask the artists to maybe say a few words about themselves and to introduce themselves, if that's okay with you. Because there's only 3 of you, and I'm really kind of excited to learn a little bit more about your time in Meteora. I've seen some pictures on Instagram, and it seems like you're having an amazing time. So maybe if you want to just introduce yourself in few words, Paloma, Kate, and Rowena, and maybe you want to say just one thing which is somewhat alive for you right now, something that you took away from this week, maybe one thing which really stuck with you, either from one of the talks or one of your visits, anything really.
Hello.
Hi. Hi.
I'm very much enjoying being in Meteora. I am especially just impressed by the rocks and blown away by the physical landscape. I think it's amazing.
Hi, I'm Paloma. We all have to move forward to come interview. And this week I've got excited about doing my first raku firing at the ceramic studio where I'm working, which is something that I've wanted to do for a while and haven't. And it's a process where you take out stuff while the ceramics are still very hot, and it creates these effects depending on what you cool down the ceramics into. And I'm hoping to use horsehair and other kind of maybe natural matter to mark the ceramics. So maybe some of what you talk about might inspire those choices. Yeah.
Kate. I've been very interested in the plants and herbs while I'm here. I mean, I've finished some lots of things. But yesterday I climbed a mountain that is 900 meters high, and I picked bunches of herbs, which fortunately we were able to bring down in the car, and that was really wonderful. And I'm using these herbs and plants for a project, and I was making Paloma laugh because I was saying that this mountain is like a sacred mountain, which was like, yeah, right. And and it's where the founder of medicine in Greece is putatively at least born in a village on this mountain, Asclepius, who I'm sure you know, and who worked on his plants. And then I also went swimming in this incredible river, which is this beautiful river, river stream, but sort of like very, very cold stream. And I felt really in touch with nature, and there was this wind coming off the water. It was really amazing. So I'm very interested to know what you think about the consciousness of nature and so on, because it feels like we're very close to it here.
Thank you so much for sharing. I knew I was going to get immediately jealous upon hearing you sharing your experiences, but thank you. It's great to know what you're up to. So I'm also going to share one thing which stayed with me this week. So I went to a yoga class a few days ago, and the teacher said something which really struck me. And by the way, despite the topic of this talk, I'm not really a person who normally quotes yoga teachers in her lectures, but this one somehow was just very relevant. So we were doing this like twisting and swirling movement with the upper body, and the teacher asked us to move freely and to kind of completely let go. And she said, undo the linearity of your existence. And this phrase, undo the linearity of your existence, it somehow really, really stayed with me. And basically, I was really anxious the rest of a yoga class that I was going to forget it. And I was like, no, I need to remember it. So the undoing of the linearity of existence is something I'm particularly interested in. And when you think of this, of what it actually means, this linearity, I guess the first thing that probably comes to mind is the linearity of our immediate environments, the architecture, the office spaces, the technology, like everything comes in those rectangular and square forms and shapes. Then, and on the other hand, there is a linearity of time. So we think of time as this linear progression from the past to the present to the future. And actually, since we're in Greece, ancient Greeks had a word for this linear time progression, which is chronos. But they also distinguished something different. They had another notion of time, which is kairos. And kairos, as opposed to chronos, kairos actually notes the fact that time is not always linear, and it doesn't. So 1 week may like last for ages, and another week might just blow by super quickly. So they kind of recognize this differentiation between the linear time of chronos and the time of event, which is kairos. And then thirdly, when it comes to linearity, it's a linearity of existence is the linearity of our thinking and of our minds. And the undoing of the linearity of thinking is exactly what I'm interested in my research and somewhat more broadly in life, I suppose. And this is also where my interest in mystical states comes from, because it's exactly what enables this undoing. And that's something I'm going to try and talk about today. So actually, I'm going to share slides, which I got to do earlier. Quite a big chunk of my talk was inspired by someone called Rhiannon Salisbury, who's an artist and a colleague of yours. And I only met Rhiannon recently because I was approached by her gallery asking me to write an essay for her upcoming show in Edinburgh. And so a few things I was going to say and show are inspired and kind of come directly from the research I did for this essay. So Rhiannon's show is called Chthoniya, and you may have come across the word Chthoniya in Donna Haraway, but also Chthoniya, of course, comes from the ancient Greek and symbolizes the divine earth, the terrestrial and the subterraneous, personified by the Greek goddess of the agriculture and fertility, the grain mother Demeter. And his description of Greece, it's a title of the work, Pausanias, a Greek traveler and geographer of the 2nd century, describes an eponymous summer festival, which was celebrated annually in the Greek town of Hermione in honor of Demeter. They form a procession headed by the priests and magistrates of the year, who are followed by men and women. And even children participate, and they pay homage to the goddess by joining the procession. They wear white garments, and on their heads, they have flowers, which they call kosmosandaloi. So Pausanias suggests that this mysteriously named kosmosandaloi, or cosmic sandals, is a flower called hyacinthus. Actually, it's not hyacinth that they know today, but it's a flower called larkspur, whose blooms indeed resemble an elegant female sleeper. So Pausanias suggests that, as I mentioned, this kosmosandaloi, cosmic sandals, is larkspur, whose blooms, as you see in this image, indeed resemble an elegant female slipper. But this, the original Greek name, however, really perplexes me. Surely cosmic sandals ought to have some deeper consciousness expanding connotations than the shoe-like morphology alone. And could Pausanias have mistaken the flower for another species, say aconite or henbane, whose toxic, hallucinogenic, and potentially deadly properties could indeed induce a cosmic travel to worlds far and beyond? So over the next few days, I went to the British Library and basically went into a deep rabbit hole of trying to understand what were these cosmic sandals. But my curiosity remains unquenched. It is indeed appear as innocent as the ancient geographer Pausanias has proposed. But nevertheless, I wasn't too far off in my inquiries. So in ancient Greek myth of Demeter and her daughter Persephone, larkspur makes appearance at a crucial moment of a tragedy. Persephone and her companion nymphs were gathering rose, crocus, violet, iris in a springtime meadow. And it is when reaching out for larkspur blossoms that the young goddess gets abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld. Next slide, please. So the purple blooms serve as a premonition, indicating a dark and mysterious journey that Persephone is about to undertake, the journey to the world of the dead. Desperate, Persephone's mother, Demeter, embarks on a search for her missing daughter. And she's so distressed that she stops her usual nurturing of a natural world. If you remember, Demeter is the mother of agriculture and of earth. So once she stops caring about the natural world, the grain withers and the harvest suffer. And of course, this causes the widespread suffering of a common people as well. And finally, on the 9th day of her agony, Demeter arrives to the town of Eleusis, and she's disguised as a mortal. She doesn't show that she's a goddess. The town, however, welcomes her warmly, and it is specifically near Eleusis that the mother and the daughter, Demeter and Persephone, are finally reunited. And in reward for the town's hospitality, the goddess reveals her true identity and shares the secret rites that came to be known as the Eleusinian Mysteries. For 2,000 years, Eleusinian Mysteries remain one of the most important and most secretive rites of ancient Greece, providing emotional healing, nurturing the connection with the earth Gaia, and spurring the spiritual enlightenment of its devotees. Next slide, please. This annual rite included a ritual bath in the sea, 3 days of fasting, and completion of a central ceremony that involved the ingestion of a specially prepared drink, kukion, in a celebration of the Chthonian goddess. So what's fascinating about Eleusinian mysteries is that it was perhaps one of the most democratic consciousness expanding festivals in human history. Women, slaves, non-citizens were all welcome. And the only rule was to keep the rapture ceremony that took place within the temple a strict secret, with death punishment for non-compliance. So in this way, the story of Demeter and Persephone's grief-stricken separation and subsequent joyful reunion served as a catalyst for performing ecstatic rituals intended to evoke an ineffable experience and sent initiates on a blissful and delirious journey, one that provided mystical communion with the Chthonic divinities, connecting soul and body, life and death, the earth and the underworld. So cosmic sandals, cosmosandaloi, after all, delivered on its cosmic promise. Next slide, please. So aside from Lexter, with its mythical, if not directly psychotropic identification with journeying, the cult of Demeter is linked with pretty much all entheogenic plants known to have used in the magical practices from antiquity and till the present day. Mandrake, belladonna, datura, henbane, poppy. Actually, if we come back for a second to the previous image, Phoebe, please. So the poppy in particular was associated with fertility and abundance, and consequently with our earth goddess Demeter. And it's easy to imagine why, if you remember poppy, poppy has, they contain this myriad of seeds inside. And Demeter is often portrayed with this opium poppies, and as well as wheat and barley, you can see here. And Persephone is often depicted rising from the underworld, accompanied by a motif of poppy heads and lily leaves. And so while the composition of Kuklion, a sacred drink that was served at the Eleusinian rites, remains a mystery, there is some new research across history, archaeology, archaeochemistry, and paleobotany that is gradually starting to uncover its recipe. And this research shows that the drink may have been spiked with ergo, a hallucinogenic fungus that affects rye and barley, and it also contains other mind-altering herbs. So Kuklion enabled the initiates of the mysteries and ecstatic descent into the underworld, where Persephone would meet them, and providing access to a totally different state of awareness, a world of utter paradox, a world of unlinear thinking. And psychedelic fungi, itself a largely subterranean creature, may have been the key ingredient. So as far as I can see, there is nothing accidental about the fact that the cult associated with earth fertility and verdant vegetal abundance is the very same cult that involved the widespread ingestion of various plants and mushrooms, entheogenic substances that induce a mystical sense of wholeness, oneness, unity with the natural world, and its cycles of growth, decay, death, and transformation. For centuries, humans across cultures and religions performed regular rituals that promoted this deep sense of cosmic unity, while shamans, prophets, and healers played a key role in mending the traumas, both personal and collective, and maintaining the sense of connectedness with a more than human world. 2 slides forward, please, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So in this next section of my talk, I'm going to try to explain a little bit more about this connection between mysticism and ecological consciousness, and a little bit about plants as well. But to give to sort of take a step back and to explain why any of this matters. Today's ongoing and intensified eco-crisis present an increasingly likely existential threat to both human and more than human beings on this planet. And while secular approaches, namely activism, environmental activism, and direct political action, are absolutely key in making any real discernible environmental progress, yet today they have proven insufficient to turn things around and bring an urgently necessary radical change. In recent decades, however, we've also seen another parallel trend, which could potentially be extremely important. And it's a trend which is growing exponentially, and it's the intersection of environmentalism and spirituality. Spiritual ecology refers to the spiritual aspects of human environment cosmos interactions and encompasses a sacred approach to understanding of our dependence on and interrelationship with the earth, the Gaia. And within the context of spiritual ecology, there is this recognition of the intrinsic value of nature, value which is moral and spiritual and ethical. And next slide, please. Spirituality in the context of spiritual ecology is closely linked with mysticism and mystical phenomena, such as the profoundly moving experiences, ecstatic and altered states that can generate visions, meaning, purpose, and direction for an individual's life in pursuit of the sacred. Mysticism is viewed as the experiential core of human spiritual experience, and it's completely independent of religious beliefs. You find examples of mystical states across different cultures, religions, and traditions. And I view them as extremely important, including for the key argument of my thesis, which I'll talk a little bit more about later down the line, because they can make a significant change to one's cosmological beliefs and ontological position, particularly as this relates to the notion of self and its relation with nature and other life forms, and to seeing ultimate reality as the ground of being that underlies all existence and is far grander than our own systems of thought. A profound realization can arise that the separation between humans and the environment, between us and so-called nature, is a false dichotomy. Humans are embedded in and are an integral part of a cosmic whole. And this non-dualistic view reflects the ultimate elemental unity of our existence. Nature and spirit are inseparable, and there's only one reality. And this continuity can be sensed and experienced in a mystical state. And just to give you a bit of, I guess, of a preview of my research, which is interested in this interconnection between mystical states, nature, and art. And as Phoebe mentioned in the introduction, I looked particularly at the work of Hilma af Klint and Emma Kunz. And the two of them regularly created art in states which can only be described as mystical. Af Klint, in the process of and following her communing with the higher beings, her spiritual guides, she called the high masters, and Emma Kunz while in a state of trance. And so, I look at both Emma Kunz and Af Klint through this lens of their mystical states and their experience of a union and communion with ultimate reality, and the way they received spiritual truths through this mystical practice and subjective experience. But just to explain a little bit more about mystical states and what they are and how we can think of them. First of all, I don't know if any of you has experience of anything which is kind of close to mystical states, but if you ask anyone to describe one, what people usually say is that they are indescribable, and justly so. Nevertheless, of course, scientists always try to describe anything undescribable, and including mystical experiences. And in his seminal review of mysticism in various religious and non-religious traditions, philosopher Walter Stace, already in 1960, theorized a distinct type of mystical consciousness, which can be achieved through a variety of cultural practices. So even though the states are indescribable, Stace's work provides a phenomenological model of mystical experiences. He studied the descriptions of mystical states from a wide variety of sources, and he identified a range of common themes that can characterize an experience as mystical. So Stace argued that basically all mystical states have a common core of phenomenological features that are independent from the interpretation of those experiences. And you can see a list of these common features on this page, which is basically a loss of self, a sense of unity, a loss of sense of space and time, paradoxicality of mystical states, the profound joy, the sacredness and ineffability, and also acknowledging the fact that the experience provides a new sense of knowledge of reality. And as a rule, this sense of gaining access to a new kind of knowledge is very strong. However, now, mystical states are, of course, very difficult to study. And first of all, they're unpredictable and they're rare. And even though there is research which basically put Buddhist monks through the MRI scans, generally you can't really bring like a bunch of monks or a bunch of Christian saints, put them in a lab and study them. So how can you actually approach mystical states from kind of a purely scientific perspective? Well, luckily there is a way to perform a controlled, to study mystical states for controlled empirical research, and this is through the use of psychedelic substances. And today there is a growing and actually quite exciting body of research in psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience that I find quite useful to study, and it's the research of therapeutic potential of entheogenic substances, also known as classic psychedelics. And descriptions of so-called naturally occurring mystical experiences, the ones, for example, in Stace, appear strikingly similar and indeed indistinguishable from the profound spiritual experiences occasioned by hallucinogenic substances, such as LSD, MDMA, DMT, psilocybin from psychoactive mushrooms, etc. So experimental psychedelic research actively utilizes classic hallucinogens to study the subjective nature, characteristics, and consequences of mystical type experiences. And of course, this research makes it much more kind of easier to study and interpret because it's more tractable. You can perform double-blind studies, and also entheogenic substances occasion mystical experiences with high probability, and it's basically dose dependent. The more you take, the higher the probability that you're going to have a profound mystical experience. And indeed, there was a research performed at the Johns Hopkins University, I believe in 2010, which showed that people who described the states that they have gone through as mystical, they also rated them as one of the top five most meaningful experiences of their life. So the lab-induced psychedelic experience was one of the top 5 most important experiences of their life, alongside the birth of their first child and like a loss of their parent. So it is indeed quite paradoxical. Next slide, please. So psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond was one of the very early researchers of the applications of psychedelic substances for therapeutic use. And indeed, he's the one who invented the word psychedelic. He describes this experience he had with peyote, which acts by emphasizing one's own self, by expanding it into the selves of others with a deepening empathy or infilling. The self is dissolved, and in being dissolved, enriched. This is basically like one of the classical descriptions. And if you remember the Walter Status scale that I showed earlier, the two features of a classical mystical, any mystical states are the loss of a sense of self and a sense of unity. And really they're critical features, and they're very important also when it comes to my interest of mystical states and their connection with the sense of union with the natural world. Next slide, please. So states, I don't think actually I'm going to go into this because the time is running fast, but states describe two types of experiences as extroverted and introverted. You can see the two, again, like two descriptions here. If you have a time to read, the one on the left is sort of more introverted, the one on the right more extroverted. But what's common about them is that there is this recognition of the oneness of all, in which one finds unity at the core of inner subjectivity or inner reality of all things, despite the diversity or apparent individual identity and separation. So such self-transcendent experiences stand in stark contrast to our typical day-to-day perspective, defined by the self, the ego, and the conceptual representation of ourselves as separate individuals, rather than part of a unified whole. Crucially, such experiences remind the person who is undergoing the mystical state that they are part of a wider living system, and they induce a sense of the underlying reality, underlying unity of a natural world. And a profound realization can arise that the separation between humans and their environment, between us and nature, is a false dichotomy, as I mentioned earlier, that humans are embedded in and are integral part of a cosmic whole. Next slide, please. So this sense of unity and the sense of a loss of self sort of automatically translates in a sense of connectedness with nature. Deep reverence for life and ecological awareness are among the most frequent consequences of a psychospiritual transformation that accompanies responsible work with non-ordinary states of consciousness. This is a quote from Stanislav Grof. And this relationship, it kind of goes both ways. So already 19th, early 20th century philosopher and psychologist William James noted that nature has a unique ability to incite mystical experiences. And indeed, mystical states arise kind of more frequently when we are surrounded by, when we are out there in nature, outdoors. And they are more likely to elicit mystical experience and often associated with a sense of unity and oneness. But the opposite is also true, which is what I find so fascinating, that not only do natural environments generate mystical states, but in reverse, mystical states actually, whether they are sort of naturally occurring or induced by psilocybin and other entheogenic substances, they represent a powerful facilitator of nature connectedness and pro-environmental behavior. And I think what a lot of these studies today in neuroscience and psychiatry, they kind of just say, like a blank statement, a natural setting, and they don't really explain what that means and why this is important. But for me, it seems clear that when they say a natural setting, they imply a green environment. They imply the abundant presence of vegetation surrounding the experiencer and anticipating this peak moment. So plants, really, the way I view them, is they're important facilitators of this experience and the ensuing sense of interconnectedness. And not to be unfair to animals, animals, of course, also induce a sense of awe and love and admiration of for nature. But plants, arguably, they play a key role in promoting the sense of interconnectedness due to their unique ontology and unique ways of being that we observe when out there in nature. Yeah, let me just go maybe to the next slide. So we spoke a little bit about this connection between mystical states and nature connectedness and plants. And actually what I'm trying to do is just to add element by element and to kind of throw some more concepts at you to explain what my research about. So we talked about mysticism, we talked about mystical states, we talked about the connection with nature. And finally, I'm adding the last element, which is art, to bring it all together and to try to explain why I see those interconnections and parallels as really quite fascinating. Just to check in, how's everyone doing? Are we all still alive? Yeah, still here. So in the last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about Emma Kunz and her unique practice and her connection with plants and her harnessing of the mystical states. Do you guys know about Emma Kunz at all? Yeah, I'm sure you all heard of her. So yeah, if at any moment it becomes maybe a bit too familiar, just let me know. But just to give a bit of general introduction for those of you who don't know, Emma Kunz should have put down her date of birth. She was born in 1892 and she died in 1963. She was a researcher, a botanist, a medium, and a healer. And today we know her also as an artist. Her holistic practice encompassed all of his activities, drawing no distinctions and no disciplinary lines. Kunz was a holistic healer who had gifts of telepathy and extrasensory perception. And in her 40s, she began practicing a form of radiesthesia. Next slide, please. She drew onto millimeter graph paper, guided by her divining pendulum, while in a state of highest concentration and mediumistic channeling. The resulting large-scale, highly complex geometric linear drawings were typically multi-layered in their construction and possible readings. At the primary level, they open up to her the cryptic answers to numerous questions that interested her or her patients and her community. And these questions were sometimes spiritual and philosophical in nature. Sometimes they were political. She was once asked about Adolf Hitler. And sometimes they were meant to provide an explanation for the cause and treatment of an illness. And the resulting drawings are enigmatic and they're intensely beautiful, I find. And they're quite mesmerizing in their cosmic geometry and their radiant outlines. And so my interest in these drawings and in Kunz stems from her unique psychic capacities and combined also with her profound botanical and ecological attunement. So these drawings have a direct, immediate, and tangible result of the heightened states, of the altered states of consciousness that she was able to enter, and which allowed her to sense the energies and vibrations of plants, animals, rocks, and the place itself, and to use this to restore the imbalance in the patient's mind and body. Next slide, please. Kunz demonstrated a strong spiritual sensibility from an early age. She walked barefoot near trees to discover their spiritual vibrations, and as she grew older, she developed strong conviction that plants and minerals could transmit healing energies, and as well as learning how to harness those through her potions and regimens, and also through her drawing. And although Kunz deliberately kept herself isolated, she never wanted to become a public figure. The famous Indian guru, Sri Aurobindo, recognized her importance, and he sent 3 delegations to Switzerland, inviting her to come to India and become a guru. But she never agreed. She was opposed to any missionary activities, and she believed that all human work should be done locally, focusing on a place where one was born and working with its vibrations and its potentialities. In her practice, she used only local herbs and rocks, and she treated members of her community with the healing vibratory capacities, energetically charged by the place they were coming from. And this approach already demonstrates that practice is deeply ecological to its very core. As I mentioned today, we know Emma Kunz is an artist, but during her lifetime, she was primarily a healer. And patients came to her seeking cures from physical and mental illnesses. She used her pendulum and the drawings to diagnose and heal, and she prescribed special fruits and agents from plants and stones, earth and water. So she therefore practiced a holistic approach, and she criticized the narrow training of medical practitioners. Next slide, please. Actually, yeah, this one, thank you. So in one extraordinary example of her otherworldly capacities, she used the pendulum to polarize marigolds in her garden to produce multiple flower heads, and she documented the result with the photographs. So just to explain, normally a marigold might bear one extra flower head, like in rare occasions, but she created this flower bed, and the number of this additional flower heads on each bloom was increasing row after row, following a Fibonacci sequence. So first row with one extra flower, second row with 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. So a miraculous feat of sorts, as normally, as I said, marigolds can only bear one single flower head. So while her abilities were miraculous, Kunz gave no credence to the word miracle itself. She believed that her intuitions were based on laws and facts, stating, there are no miracles, only principles. And the question is whether we can work with this. And she sensed a spiritual intuition within all humanity, and she believed that anyone was capable of employing healing energies. And with this in mind, she even provided explanations of the drawing method in 2 books. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, reading those books doesn't bring us any closer to understanding of her powers. But she says that she has to thank 4 factors: the count of 3 folders, the living word, sign language, and the pictorial power of nature. And the pictorial power and nature of being and form, she refers to pictorial powers of nature as pictorial powers of being and form, such as crystal, plant, animal, and human. And she may have experienced the echoes of these pictorial powers as a physical sensation of vibrations from the earth. Next slide, please. So according to the testimony of her friend, one of her ever-recurring statements was the one you see on this page, is that everything happens in accordance with a certain regularity, which I sense inside me and which never lets me rest. So Kunz made drawings to explore this very regularities, this natural forces, and this unity which she sensed and tried to express in her artistic practice. And next slide, please. So I'm really interested in Kunz and in the context of this botanical mysticism and her profound attention to and connection with the vegetal life. And her drawings, as you see, they're mainly geometric. They don't have any visible floral, botanical, biomorphic elements. However, they stem from her direct experience of and connection with the thinking and being of plants, with their life force and their energetic field of plants, but also of other non-humans. She grew plants, she watched them, she listened to them, she performed her magic on them, as in the marigold experiment that I told you about. So Kunz's thinking and healing practice were profoundly vegetal and botanically aligned, and plants were her conduit for listening and for healing. And to remind you that, again, as I said, Kunz was able to sort of harness this mystical space, and really her practice is centered on this space of deep trance that she was able to enter. And her drawings can be thought of as maps. Starting from a blank sheet of paper, she would receive and translate information into visuals while in this particular altered state or kind of hypnotic dream that she would enter through swinging her pendulum. And she often recounted that ordered systems of points had suddenly appeared before her inner eye. At times, it seemed as if a picture was completing itself outside of her own consciousness, as if her hands were being guided. Once a line was drawn, it turned out to be the germ cell of a picture, the determining inner principle and measure of the work. And from this point, the work proceeded more or less automatically. Emma Kunz merely needed to follow the outlines of her vision. She needed only to urge forward the structure that increasingly grew out of its own internal necessities. And there's Heini Widmer, a curator who was like the very first curator to show Emma Kunz in the 1970s. He provides this peculiar formulation of Kunz's method. He writes in 1974 that Emma Kunz used the pendulum as a stimulant, just as other artists attempted to put themselves into a state favorable to their work through appropriate measures. And Anton Meyer, one of Kunz's patients and very rare people to witness her at work, said that there was no counting, no calculating, no measuring, no geometrical construction, only the execution of a direct inspiration. So really what sounds as a description of a mystical or an ecstatic state. And as she was channeling this invisible palace, she would work fast and without a break, sometimes for more than 24 hours in one sitting. And while Kunz did not claim to be channeling messages from beyond, like Hilma Flynn did, for example, who was following guidance from the higher masters, rather their genesis is in the vibrations of the earth and its indwelling creatures, and plants and animals and rocks, and all those invisible and multifarious powers of the natural world. So moving to the end of my talk, as we're running out of time. Can we go to the next slide, please? So when we read exhibition catalogs and reviews of Emma Kunz, we often read that she was a researcher. And repetitively, and like a lot of articles, if you have a look, it says that she was not just some kind of weird esoteric mystic; she was a researcher. And this is actually also true for Hilma Flynn's practice. But what some of us critics fail to do, I'd argue, is to take seriously that the idea that artists like Hilma Flynn and Emma Kunz explored realms of imagination that pushed the very boundaries of rational determination. And indeed, they were researchers, but we also need to consider mystical research as a valid form of research. Aldous Huxley in 1947 proposed that mystics may be considered empirical theologians. And yet there's something about mystical states that we seem to fear so much. William James, I mentioned earlier, he described mystical states as having a noetic quality, meaning that the states, they are states of feeling, they're subjective experiences, but they're also states of knowledge. They allow direct insights into depths of truth that are unplumbed by our mere intellects. They are illuminations, revelations, full of significance and importance, and they carry with them what James describes as a curious sense of authority. So I also view mystical states as informational states. They really produce a huge amount of information and knowledge, and I think we kind of repetitively throughout history fail to recognize their importance. And to go back for a moment, this very final part of my talk is, if you remember, we started off in Greece at the Eleusinian mysteries. And this sacred rites at Eleusis were so essential that if we read the description of the contemporary, the life of the Greeks would become abiotos, unlivable, if they were prevented from properly observing the most sacred mysteries. These mysteries were something that held the whole human race together, and in their absence, life was to become unlivable and unthinkable. Well, of course, what happened is that with the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, Eleusinian mysteries and other similar rites were persecuted and eventually banned by the Roman Emperor Theodosius in 392 AD. And centuries later, today, in our current age of the global ecocide and the epidemic death cult of the capitalist system, life does become increasingly abiotos, unlivable and unthinkable, unavailable to think with. But the myths and divinities of our story, where we started off with Demeter and Persephone, I'd argue they're not imaginary. They are the tormented roots of our Western civilization. They are where our very culture comes from. And as philosopher of mystical tradition, Peter Kingsley writes, actually in this book, which I highly recommend, slowly, gradually, they have been misunderstood. And as a part of that process, we have misunderstood ourselves. And as a result, Kingsley writes, Western civilization may soon be nothing but an experiment that failed. We say that of Emma Kunz that her work sought unity. But I would argue that she was not searching for unity, or certainly not searching it from some kind of point zero. Rather, she was reaffirming the sense of unity that she had already experienced while in a mystical state, and seeking the visual language for expressing this unity. Her work is not a quest for the unity of dualities, but the affirmation, translation, and remembering of a feeling and knowledge of unity that arises in a mystical state. And the resulting artworks are the cosmic mandalas, the archetypes of wholeness that she discovered through her spiritual and her artistic practice. So traditionally, in our society in the West, this knowledge of plants, the mystical practices involving herbalism and plants have been guarded by women, from priestesses of ancient Greece to female mystics, witches, midwives of the Middle Ages, someone like Hildegard of Bingen, who I haven't had a chance to mention, but who's also very important. And this verdant knowledge has been gradually erased, marginalized, bent down, along with the practitioners who performed their healing rituals against the decrease and persecution of the church fathers. But their fragrant floral knowledge did not disappear altogether. Its roots went deep underground in the subterranean domain of Persephone, from where Emma Kunz, that argue, could sense those earthly vibrations, and from where we're starting to gradually uncover and bring it back to light today through reclamation of botanical knowledge and through art. This is all I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
That was really brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to unshare my screen.
Thank you so much, Phoebe, for staying with me throughout.
No, not at all. I'm just going to stop sharing that. And then what we'll do is, if anyone has any questions or any comments they'd like to share, so I've got the sun right in my eyes, you're very welcome to do that now.
I'm aware we're running out of time, but yeah, if you have two questions.
I just wanted to ask, is your knowledge of mystical or spiritual states only theoretical? Or this is something you've experienced?
I hope I don't. I wonder actually if I'm going to get asked this question at my thesis defense. So I kind of consider, this is supposed to be academic research. I consider it as a highly personal research. It stems from my interest, my experience, my meditation practice, my kind of staying out in the forest for a few months, a few years ago, where I think the first seeds of this research were actually rooted. And so definitely it kind of comes from this personal experience on one hand, and the profound concern for the ecological crisis and the suffering that we're imposing on modern human beings. So yeah, I see no issue of my research being kind of deeply interconnected with those subjective experiences and subjective concerns.
Yes, I just wanted to say briefly that for me, I swim in the sea very regularly, and it's become a very important part of my life. And it is a kind of a spiritual experience, which sounds kind of daft in some ways, but it's like being immersed in nature and being immersed like part of nature so regularly that it starts to change the way you think or experience the world. It's like this meditation practice of feeling the ego dissolving or the self dissolving and becoming part of nature. I experienced with swimming, and also, which also sounds a little dark, but through drawing, through being completely absorbed in making something, to the extent that you forget time passing and forget all the other things that are in your mind. I mean, in psychology, this is called flow, of being completely immersed in an activity, which sort of scientifically they would name flow, but I guess if you were more kind of spiritually or religiously inclined, you'd give it another name.
Yeah, no, I mean, flow states are also super interesting. And again, there is interesting neuroscience research about the flow states and kind of like what specific brain waves are being activated in those states, which is to some extent not too dissimilar from dream states as well. And thank you so much for sharing also about your personal experience. I have to say, I see so many people around me doing this regular practice of immersion and of swimming, like particularly this year, and I think it kind of started last year. And I'm going to find this quote by a nature philosopher, his name I forget now, but basically the way I came across that particular quote on his blog was that as part of my research, I write about the notion of sublime, and I kind of critique this 18th and 19th century notion of sublime, because even though it's a sense of awe and inspiration that comes from experience or being out in the nature, but usually it denotes the sense of separation. It's like you and the huge mountains, you and the ocean, and there's always this sense of division. It's like this, the sublime is basically this. It's a fear of the grandness of nature, but it's also a recognition of the superiority of the human mind, because like, look at me, I'm able to experience this incredible feelings and this this kind of the sense of being small. Being small, but also like my mind being much bigger than this nature. And this particular nature philosopher was exactly saying that it's a state of, he was betting on swimming as something that could revert this notion of sublime, because swimming is so embodied, you're fully, like you're literally immersed in water, and you cannot have that separation because you become one with water.
You're also extremely vulnerable. If you're swimming in a deep sea, it's not your natural environment. There are all these animals in the sea that can sense and move much better than you can, and they can see you before you see them. So it's also tied to a sense of fear or being vulnerable in that environment, which, and actually feeling yourself as another animal in nature. I think swimming is for me a unique compared to, say, walking in nature or being on top of a mountain or in a forest, which are magical experiences, but you're not, it's very difficult to become part of the landscape and the environment in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we all have kind of our ways in, whether it's for some people it's a forest, for other people it's in meadows, for other people it's ocean. It's like whatever brings out the magic for you. But thank you for sharing. I hope you have amazing swimming experiences out there in Greece.
Aliya, thank you so much for sharing your incredible research. And I hope it was the first, it's the beginning of our lecture series with you. And we will continue that during the year within our learning program. And I had many questions, but I don't want to hold you. And I'll ask it later. But thank you so much. It was absolutely incredible. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Right. So time for one more question, anyone? Or shall we get on with our days? Back to the linearity of our existence.
If we have time, can I ask one question?
Please.
It was about this sequence that you mentioned with Emma Kunz when she was growing her plants, right? Mm-hmm. Or did I understand it correctly? Okay, so I was wondering if she used this Fibonacci sequence like knowing what she's doing, or was it discovered afterwards that she's using Fibonacci sequence?
I actually don't know specifically whether she was like, forcing plants to have a specific amount of flowers. I somehow doubt that she would have that kind of attitude. It's like, you're going to have 1 flower, and you're going to have 3 flowers, and you're going to have 5 flowers. I imagine her working with those marigolds was kind of much more on a kind of allowing them to do whatever it is that was, that was expressing itself through growth and blossoming. I know she was interested in mathematics, and she was, so at one point when she started producing her drawings, that was in the hello dog. When she just started making those drawings, she came across a mathematical drawing in the newspaper by some like Swiss mathematician who basically produced a diagram which looked strikingly similar to her own drawings, and she was really kind of taken aback by it. And for her, that was another sign of the fact that there's this unity in everything, whether it's from mathematical knowledge or from mystical experience, that somehow there was a way to access this underlying unity of existence. So I think, that's where her interest in mathematics comes from. I don't know if it was, specifically somehow after the Fibonacci sequence. But again, Fibonacci sequence is something which organically manifests in so many life forms, whether it's,
absolutely
spiral cells.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm just very curious and still researching. And even Ainalaiyn space is a symbol, is a spiral.
The spiral, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm very interested in that, and I'm discovering it. And of course, it's a universal symbol of, and it's everywhere. But thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Mira.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think we might have to draw it to a close there. But thank you so much. It's been such a fantastic lecture. And is there anywhere, like, if people want to follow you and keep up to date with your research?
Oh yeah, that was the last. That was my last slide. I forgot to share. Oh no! If you want to find me, connect with me, I think you can Google my name, and you'll very easily find either some social media or my university email. So just feel free to get in touch if there are any follow-up questions or anything you'd like to ask and chat about. And good luck on your residence. And as ever, jealous, and wish you many magical, mystical connections with the more than human world out there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Have a lovely
Thank you
day.
so much. Thank you everyone
Bye.
for coming. Thank you. Bye.